Good evening. On behalf of the Stanford Health Library and the Caregiver Center at Stanford Hospital, I'd like to welcome you to Winter Stars, a conversation with Dave Iverson. Dave is a longtime broadcast journalist, and Bay Area audiences probably know him best as the former Friday host of Forum on KQED. He's also a documentary filmmaker and a writer. And my name is Kathy Zonana, and I edit Stanford Magazine, the alumni magazine of Stanford University. And the reason that we are here together tonight is actually because, once upon a time, Dave, who is an alum of Stanford, sent a beautiful essay to Stanford Magazine, and it was about moving in with his mother when he was 59 years old and she was 95, and about how he moved into his boyhood home, his childhood bedroom, his twin bed, and then more or less stayed there for another 10 years. That essay
sounds so attractive.
Don't you all want to do it? Yeah. So that is part of the backstory of 5 years later, what has become this beautiful book, Winter Stars. And we're going to just have a conversation about caregiving broadly, about Dave's experience specifically, but also about some of the universal aspects of what I think is a nearly universal experience. You can post questions in chat. About 3/4 of the way through, we will take questions and kind of keep this a two-way dialogue. But I'm going to start by asking Dave if he can read a little bit from the prologue of his book, which really sets up this 10-year caregiving odyssey.
Sure. Thank you, Kathy. Yeah, the prologue begins with my decision to help my mom, who had always been fiercely independent, and after my dad had passed away, and had done really well into her 90s. But at that point, something happened, as often is the case, and that's when this story begins. My mom had lived independently for 13 years after my dad died, but at age 95, she'd had a difficult bout with pneumonia and couldn't manage fully on her own. And it didn't take much deliberation to decide that it just made sense for me to move in and help. My mom and I had always been close. We'd shared interests and passions. But more than that, there'd always been a certain ease to our relationship. We understood each other. We were a comfortable pairing. And with that, at the age of 59, I moved back into my boyhood home. But there was a great deal I didn't know. I didn't know I'd become so exhausted. I didn't know that I would be capable of getting so angry. I didn't know that I would be tested in ways I'd never imagined or rewarded in ways I'd never dreamed. I didn't know I'd be joined by remarkable women caregivers who became my teachers, my comrades, and my kin, or that I'd discover that the Parkinson's disease that I'd been diagnosed with a few years before would present fewer challenges than being a caregiver. And I never imagined that after I moved back in, my mom would live for another full decade before passing away at the age of 105.
Thank you. I know one of the things you've said is that you made this decision to move in and care for your mom in about 10 seconds.
Yeah.
So tell me about those 10 seconds.
You know, it's true, and it just seems so unbelievably naive to me now, but I think it's because I could, you know, at its most basic, I could. My mom and I had always been close. I lived 30 miles away. I was at a point in my career where I had that kind of flexibility. So even though I was working full-time, hosting a radio show, making documentary films, I could. And I just felt like, well, why not? I can do this. And you know, she was 95, so it wasn't like I was thinking this would be a long-term proposition, which of course it became. So it was, and it also shows a little bit of hubris on my part, that I thought, well, of course, I'm good at doing things. I'm good at making plans and taking care of stuff, and of course I can do this. So it was an easy choice, and then not so easy after that.
Right. When you just said, why not? And I thought, well, tell us why not. Why, you know, if you had taken more than 10 seconds, what would you have told yourself in that moment?
How well do you do without getting much sleep? How well do you do when you're woken up, you know, 3 or 4 times a night when you don't expect to be? How well do you do when you're not really in charge anymore, like you have been for the last, 40 years or so of your life? How well do you do when your best laid plans fall apart, even though you made them like yesterday? How well, you're a guy who likes to be right. Well, how well are you going to do when it doesn't matter whether you're right or not, because there's something more important than that to do? All of those sorts of questions. Well, how are you going to fare with money? What are you going to do if you decide you can't do it anymore? How are you going to find your way out? How are you going to balance this with everything else in your life? How are you going to feel about your siblings and who does what? There's so many things that I just didn't even think about. All of those things are worth asking, though I will say there's a certain benefit to not knowing or not asking those questions, because then you do jump in. And I'm not sure I would have if I had gone through that laundry list of questions I just raised.
You might not do it. I think you've also said that you were probably the natural among your siblings to do it. So were there ever any challenges or tensions around figuring out who was going to step in and provide that?
Not really. And I think this probably is not an uncommon phenomenon. I mean, I think who becomes a caregiver of an aging parent, certainly gender is a factor. I think we know if there are 4 kids in a family and there are 3 boys and 1 girl, we know where we'd place our bets, right? In my case, I had 2 brothers, so gender wasn't an issue. But my brothers both had significant health issues of their own. I knew that it was mine to do if someone was going to do that, and I really felt okay about that. But it also had to do with the bond that I think my mom and I had, that we had a different relationship. I was the one who could tease her. I was the one who could sort of poke at her. I was the one who could get her to do things. And we were not unalike, I mean, she liked being right too. She liked being in charge too. She and I were, and we both thought pretty well of ourselves, which is okay until there gets to be a sort of test of will. So my mom and I started out really close, and then that closeness was really tested in some ways, at least for me. And we found our way through that. But I think our similarities actually proved challenging in some ways over the course of our decade together.
Right. And what you've described is a couple of people who have sort of some strong personalities. And one of the things that absolutely comes through to me in the book is that your mom had a strong personality.
Yeah, she was a fearsome woman. I mean, she was and a powerful person. She was graduated tops in her class in high school and college. She'd been a teacher, a career woman right from the get-go, like many women of her generation. She stopped teaching when she became a mom after she got married. But then she was a powerhouse volunteer. She registered voters. She tutored women at the county jail. She helped start a program for kids who had special challenges here in the Bay Area. She was fiercely engaged and was always a force to be reckoned with. She got up every day thinking, what can I do next? That's how she started her day. What am I going to do today that will either make my family a bit better or the world a bit better?
And it's interesting because I assume that over those 10 years that her ability to do some of those things was no longer available to her. So then how did she handle that and how did you handle that?
Well, 2 things I think are interesting that both impacted caregiving. In some ways, you wouldn't expect my mom, who was this just this powerhouse woman at age 95, to be easy with accepting care. But she was, in the sense that I think for her it made perfect sense. It was like, well, of course the people will help me. We were lucky. I could have caregivers in during the day so that I could still go to work. I think she thought that was perfectly natural. Use a walker to get around? Well, of course. Have my son live with me too? Well, why not? I think for her it was all means to an end. It was, I want to keep living in my own home. I still want to go to Stanford games, of course. And so these are, if I can have a supporting cast to allow me to lead my life, that's good. That may sound a little arrogant, but I think that's also actually a great gift to everyone around her, because we weren't fighting her for that. She was accepting of that. So in that way, it wasn't that tough. What became tough was, I think, and it took me a long time to understand that part of when she would get angry, part of when she'd get upset was because she was no longer who she wanted to be. She wasn't out there registering voters or tutoring people at the county jail. She wasn't the host of family get-togethers the way she had been forever. And that was hard for her. And I wasn't I wasn't aware of that, I guess, as soon as I ought to have been.
And was that something that I'm guessing that might have been something she had to communicate indirectly as well?
Yeah, she would be aggravated or snappish, or she'd complain about things, or she'd say, well, this terrible thing happened to me today. I was left in the bathroom for 2 hours, which I knew couldn't really be true, but spoke, I think, to her frustrations with not being able to be the dynamo she had always been.
And I love that story in the book. You know, you come home, she tells you indignantly that the caregiver has left her in the bathroom for 2 hours. You kind of take a deep breath and you talk to the caregiver, and it turns out that your mom was sleeping. And her perception was 2 hours. And then you realize that there's perception and there's reality. And her reality was she'd been left there forever.
That's right. If you think about that two ways, my mom thought she'd been left in the bathroom for 2 hours. It turned out our daytime caregiver had helped her into the bathroom and then let her be by herself, came back a minute or two later, and Adelaide was dozing. And she just allowed her to doze for a while before gently waking her up. But to my mom, it must have felt like all of a sudden she's been awakened. What happened? What's going on? I've been left here for hours. It's not factually right. But they were her facts. You know, they were her facts. She wasn't stating an opinion. That was her reality. And I think it took me again so long to appreciate her changing reality. You know, the truth that's beneath the words. And I think that is part of what we need to do when we're caring for someone, is to not just be literal all the time. And I'm a really literal guy, you know, and to say, well, what did that feel like? Instead of saying, you weren't left in the bathroom for 2 hours.
Definitely. So then I assume that part of why you wrote the book is to convey some of what you had learned in that respect so that it might help other people who might be doing things like this.
Yes. And that as caregivers, you know, we become exhausted and we become frustrated. And yes, we can become angry. You know this from your own life experience, and you and I have talked about this. You want to be, caregiving requires you to be at your best 100% of the time, I think. And nobody can do that. And so, you know, my mom would wake up during the night to use the bathroom. It wasn't safe for her to go to the bathroom alone, so we rigged up a bell so she could ring it. So I'd stumble out of my single bed that I slept in when I was 12 and go down the hallway and help her. Well, that happens 3 or 4 times a night. You get exhausted, and then you get short-tempered, and you get angry. If you had told me, Kathy, that I would have blown up at my mom any number of times, I would have said, that's not possible. That's not who I am. That's not who she is. And it happened. And it happened again. And then it happened again.
Of course. Yeah, the next piece that you're going to read from the book is actually about anger, and I want to dive into that a little bit more. But I also want to acknowledge what you said about sleep deprivation, because at least for me, and I am the caregiver of a young man, my son, who has cerebral palsy, and I have at times been the caregiver of my daughter, who is a young adult who has a genetic connective tissue disorder. My son did not sleep through the night for 5 years. In the first 5 years of his life, and that was a lot. And it was impossible. Like, maybe I had to be at my best, but there was no chance of that. There was absolutely no chance of that. So one of the things that I found interesting about your 10-second decision, and I wonder if you grappled with this, is you've just been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. It doesn't seem likely to me that sleep deprivation is going to be good for you in that scenario. So what kind of mental, processes did you go through about thinking about, well, there's what's good for mom, and then there's what's good for me?
Absolutely. I mean, yes, it seems a little, and I know it seems perplexing to people, like, wait a minute, you were diagnosed with Parkinson's, and then 2 years later you move in with your mom? What were you thinking? And some of it was that a lot of it was that I was really lucky. Parkinson's, as you know, is a very idiosyncratic condition. I'm still doing really, really well. The medications work great for me. I've been really, really fortunate. But it was also because I wanted to feel like I could, that anybody who has anything like that, whether that's your son or daughter or anyone else, you want to feel like you can. And I felt pretty damn good about myself that I could go do this. So that was some of it too. But sure, sleep played havoc with that. Sleep is a challenge in Parkinson's anyway. But, you know, I mean, I'm sure we'll talk about this more later, but I think that people who say, well, you know, you can't be a caregiver unless you take care of yourself. Well, that's just hogwash.
Right.
You do. Caregivers do it every day because they have to. They have to. Whether they've taken care of themselves or not, the other person needs more care than you do, and so that's what you do. And part of why I wanted to write the book was to say that, so that people could say, yes, that's right.
Right. I mean, yes. And I think, why don't we go ahead and go to that portion where you do talk about anger, because I know that one of the things I most valued about the book and treasured about the book was your candor, because I think that kind of candor allows others to be candid themselves, with themselves and with others about what they're experiencing.
Okay. This is a story about one night when my mom and I were on our way to my aunt's house, who had my dad's much younger sister, who had taken over sort of hosting duties when my mom no longer could. And so we drove out to see her. On this particular night, my Aunt Alice was having my mom and me and the rest of the family over for dinner. And from the moment my mom's walker hit Alice's living room floor with an aggravated thump, I had the sense that we were all in for it. She wasn't happy, snapping at my sister-in-law when she offered her an appetizer, complaining about where she was sitting, and responding crossly when one of us tried to respond to her grievances. Finally, I stepped over to her and said, exactly as I would have to a 4-year-old, if you can't act better, we're going home. A few minutes later, we headed for the dinner table. I didn't know that you could stalk across the floor while using a walker, but my mom did. My Aunt Alice asked her where she'd like to sit, and my mom snapped at her again. That did it. That's it, I said. We're going home. I steered her out of the room, out the doorway, into the car. We drove home in silence. When we arrived back home, I ushered her into her bedroom with hands as comforting as steel. She stood next to her bed for a moment, gripping her walker, and then collapsed onto the bedspread. I hate myself, she wailed. And here's the thing. I didn't say a word. I didn't feel anything other than a cold sense of satisfaction. I was acting like a self-righteous parent who'd appropriately reprimanded a bratty but now repentant child. But as I look back, I don't think I fully took in what my mom was saying. I think when she said she hated herself, she meant exactly that. She hated who she was becoming, hated the sense that she was increasingly trapped in a world where she could no longer be who she had always been, including the person who had always hosted family occasions. My mom's wail was from the heart, but sometimes I felt like my own heart had turned cold.
So I think that's a really brave thing to put in a book. And again, I so appreciate it. So in the moment, you said you felt that sort of, I think anyone who's ever done any caregiving can relate to this, like, oh, good, you understand how badly you were behaving.
Exactly.
Now how do you sort of see now how do you see it?
I see that I wasn't hearing my mom fully. I should have understood, I think. Well, there's no point in actually saying it that way. It took me a long time to understand that her frustration, her anger was about her wanting to be someone who could still make a difference, someone who could still make a wonderful dinner and bring the family together. And now she was a guest rather than being the woman in charge.
Yeah.
You know? I didn't really understood that. And I wanted her to feel like she'd behave badly and good. Now you know. You know? Exactly like you would with a kid. And
Yeah.
she wasn't a kid. By that point, she was 98 years old, you know?
Right.
And I remember apologizing to her the next day and just saying, I'm really sorry. And I think probably naively thinking that I would never get mad again, but I did. And I did, you know, I can remember this one time, Kathy, when I got so angry with her that I made her cry. And my response was to say, good, go ahead and cry. And then I walked out of the room, slammed the door like a teenager, and stood in the garage. And I remember hearing the rain fall on the roof. And then walking back in and sitting down beside my mom and bursting into tears. And she was the one who reached over and said, don't cry, David. Don't cry.
Yeah. Which is, you know, there's so many things there, and I want to talk about the sort of family relationship and the parent and the child and you know, the role reversal in some ways. But the other thing that this makes me think about is we don't get that many opportunities to look at ourselves and the parts of ourselves that we don't necessarily love, that we aren't the most proud of. And I'm guessing that might be something that this really long, intimate, challenging caregiving experience did for you.
Yeah. I mean, you know, as we talked about earlier, I'm someone who likes being in charge. Well, as we both know, when you're a caregiver, you're not fully in charge at all. You know, I think I use the analogy in the book that you might think you're driving the car, but someone else is grabbing at the steering wheel, and your seatbelt sure isn't on, and sometimes you're not even sure if you're in the front seat and someone else is driving. It's sobering, and it's humbling, and it's reorienting. Or like we were talking about before with someone whose cognition is beginning to change, being right is worthless. It's just worthless. And so, you know, I mean, caregiving, I think I write this in the book, it's like a heat-seeking missile. It pierces your vulnerabilities and reveals your weaknesses. And the only silver lining in that is that maybe, just maybe, you begin to recognize that, and you begin to become, you know, marginally better at some of those things.
Right. One question you once asked me is, would you change it if you could?
Yeah.
Would you change it if you could? Would you do this 10 years again?
You know, I would, but here's the thing. Would I do it the same way? Of course not. You know, of course not. I would catalog everything we've just talked about, and I would go in thinking, okay, now I know these things. And then I'd be proved wrong again, you know, because that's how it is. That's how it is.
Yeah.
You have to be so constantly nimble and able to adjust and not be invested and put that other person front and center and love that person, whoever he or she may be at that moment, and honor that person, not who she's been, not who you want her to be, but who she is. So yeah, I am so glad I did that. And yes, I would like to think I'd man up and do that again. I'd try to do it differently, and I'd learn God knows what.
Right,
all over
some
again.
new different problem.
That's right. Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah. And that's the other interesting thing, right? There are kinds of caregiving that we anticipate and that we plan for and we anticipate joyfully. There are kinds that we could potentially choose to do or not to do. There are kinds that we don't necessarily have a choice. The choice is thrust upon us by circumstance or by economics. I think it would be good to talk about the different kinds of caregiving.
Yeah.
You know, you are a parent. You have also chosen to be a caregiver for your mom. You watched your mom care for your dad. So you have some axes, I think, to think about these differences.
Yeah. Yes, I think it's a really important point because they all are different. I mean, you and I have talked some about the difference between caring for a parent as opposed to being a parent caring for a child who has special needs. I think I had it easier, and you and I have talked about this before. I think, I had a choice, and when you're the mother of a child who has special needs, or the spouse of someone who is aging and has special needs, it's sort of a given. It's sort of of course you're going to do that. And I think the emotional connection is different. You can be a little bit more removed, I think, when you're a parent. Although I don't know how removed I was, but you're a little more removed. So I think all those things are different and call upon different things. And that's why if I were now to become a parent for my spouse, for example, it would be different all over again because it's a different relationship and they're different human beings.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Did you experience any sort of role reversal, with your mom?
Yeah, I mean, I was certainly the person in charge. At least I thought I was until she would remind me otherwise, But yeah, and she was graceful about a lot of that. My taking over, making decisions about things, whether everything from grocery shopping to paying the bills to all of that. She was quite graceful about all of that. There's strange role reversals too that can happen with someone, especially later in dementia. I tell the story of once walking into my mom's bedroom and her sort of greeting me with this intense glare and saying, "David, I know you were married to someone else before you were married to me," which is mind-bending. It was to me at the time. And my unhelpful response was to say, "Mom, I'm your son. I'm not your husband." But, I came to understand later still that what she probably was really saying was she wanted a husband.
Yeah.
She loved my dad to pieces. And I appeared to be available,
Yeah.
So that's what that meant, I think. I think it was another way of her saying, even though she might not have been able to even remember my dad's name at that point, that she loved Bill, and she wanted Bill to be with her. That's what I think.
One of the things that was really notable to me is, because it sounds to me like you handled that with a lot of just grace. And it was notable to me that you kept a journal so rigorously throughout this process. And I imagine that helped you remember and write the book, but I also imagine it helped you in the moment.
Totally. And you know this as a writer. Writing is a way of kind of making sense of things. To me it would become, oh, maybe that's what this was about as I would write it. And so it was really helpful to me in the moment. I think it's a useful thing probably for many caregivers to consider doing, or if not writing, then to record their thoughts on your phone or whatever it is. I think that's helpful because it's a lonely experience. Even though there are 50 million family caregivers in this country, we all often feel like we're in it by ourselves. And one of the many things I came to learn is that we do better if it's not a solitary mission. We do better if we can find a way to be supported, whether that's as fortunate as I was to have family caregivers, to have paid caregivers during the day so that I could go to work. But whether it's with siblings or friends or others, to feel like you are not alone makes all the difference.
Yeah. And I think you had an absolutely extraordinary team of caregivers, and I'm guessing that was not an accident, but that you also feel incredibly fortunate.
I'm lucky in so many ways in my life, but one of them was these remarkable women, all immigrant Americans, all women of color, all people for whom English was a second language, who came into our home and transformed it, who knew through training and I think often by culture that caring for the old is part of life's bargain, and that we need to do that with tenderness and love. But it's also a question of skill, Kathy, and skills that we don't value enough, as you know. I mean, what kind of skill does it take to keep someone from getting a bed sore?
Right.
It takes, my mom's skin was perfect almost until the day she died. And she was bedridden largely for the last 2 years of her life. That doesn't happen unless you have enormous skill. We just don't value those skills enough in this country, not nearly enough. They give us so much, and we don't honor or pay them often what they deserve. And I was able to do better than many for reasons also of good fortune and privilege. My parents had bought a house in Menlo Park in 1950 for $15,000. Well, by 2007, that was a pretty big nest egg that we could borrow against, and again and again and again. We need to do better than that. We need to do better than have a national plan that basically says, make sure your parents bought a house in Silicon Valley in 1950.
Right.
You know, then you'll be fine.
And even then, you occasionally had challenges with where is the money going to come from? Because the bill was significant.
And we don't, you know, people think, oh, well, doesn't Medicare take care of that? No, it does not.
Right. Right, until you get down to a very low asset level.
That's right. Right.
Yeah.
And then you can go on Medi-Cal in the state and get that sort of help. But otherwise, that's not an option.
Right, right. Yeah. So tell me a little bit about what you really learned from professional caregivers, because as you say, it is a skill, right?
I learned enormous respect for that. They helped me learn basic skills like how do you transfer someone from bed to commode and back again. That turns out to take skill,
yeah,
you know,
transfer.
or you'll screw up your back,
right.
You know, those kinds of things. Even, you know, ways of getting my mom into the car. You know, I had this like elaborate thing I did to try to get my mom into the front seat, and then one day I watched Eileen do it, and it was like, you know, I was like, there's so many skills like that. But even more than that, it was this sort of unending ability to be kind and to be compassionate. And even if my mom was cranky and sometimes mean, to just say, okay, Adelaide, and come back in 10 minutes later with a smile. It was extraordinary to me, that sort of constancy. You know, that sort of steadfast sense of duty and care.
Yeah. And I want to talk in particular about Eileen and Sinai because there are these two remarkable caregivers who, with you, see her all the way through. But I also remember the story of Rowanette coming in and saying, Adelaide, let's go see some flowers. And one of the things you told me was, you know, or I think actually you wrote in the book is, you, in addition to the sort of skills, can you transfer? Can you help with the commode? Can you do these things? You wanted somebody who, when they walked in, you were happy to see them.
Yeah, my litmus test in the end for when because you always wind up, I had wonderful people, some of whom were with me the entire time, but there are always people who, you know, they have lives of their own. Someone decides they want to start a family. Well, okay, you know, you find someone else. And what I learned over time was, am I going to feel happy when this person knocks on the door? Will I feel like, okay, she's here? Or will I feel like, oh, how is this going to go today? And I was so blessed with some of those people. And they each brought different things. Ronette was a woman from originally from Nicaragua who was just this buoyant, joyful, youthful, artistic woman. And she would, I used to tease her that she always spoke in exclamation points. She would say, Adelaide, you know, let's go to see the flowers. And Adelaide would go, oh, okay. And if she hadn't had that kind of enthusiasm, it might not have happened. But she would just go do that. And it was, I'm not a guy of exclamation points, you know, or impulse. And it taught me that sometimes, well, just go with that. If it occurs to you, do it. And you'll likely be right.
And they all brought different things, right? Because the reason that Eileen came into your life is she was the person at the rehab facility who could handle
That's right.
your mom's personality.
That's right. It was a fair fight. Yeah. They were an equal match, and I knew that right away. I could tell by the way Eileen walked into the room, like, "Okay, Mom."
Right. It's on.
Let the games begin.
Yeah.
But she was also so skilled, so funny, so smart and able, and so dedicated to my mom. She loved my mom.
Oh, yeah.
As did Sinai, as did Burnett. And Sinai was a softer, gentler person who loved Stanford football and would watch games with my mom and get her to Mass on time, which I rarely did.
Right.
You know? They each brought something truly wonderful.
Right. Yeah. Right. Exactly. I'm wondering if you would be willing to read the little passage where Eileen, takes charge.
Yeah.
In her own Eileen way.
Yes, exactly. This was at a point where my mom needed a hospital bed, and Eileen told me that. And so this is what happened next. Eileen told me that it was time for my mom to use a hospital bed. I knew she was right, but I almost immediately began dreading having to move my mom's queen bed out of her bedroom. But late one night, a few days later, the doorbell rang, and it was Eileen's 18-year-old son and 3 of his Pacific Islander pals, who all looked big enough to be starting linemen for the Stanford football team. Eileen had asked them to help move the furniture, so they'd driven the 70 miles from Eileen's home to Menlo Park at 11 o'clock to do just that. When I asked Eileen later how she had cajoled 4 teenagers into lending a helping hand late at night, she said, "Because you and Adelaide are family, and I'm the mom."
I love that. It's also, there came to a point as Eileen and Sinai are helping you, and you feel like the 3 of you are in a partnership.
Yeah.
And then there's a point where you feel like, actually, I need to step back. Yeah. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, it happened after another moment of anger. I was building a fire for my mom, who loved a fire in the fireplace. I was building a fire one evening, and she kept telling me, "Sinai didn't take me to church." And I'd say, "No, Mom, she did. Sinai didn't take me to church. Mom, she did." And so it went on and on. And finally I snapped at her and I yelled and I said, "Mom, she took you to church. You just don't remember." And I remember turning and looking into the fire and thinking, who am I becoming? And then the next morning, just feeling like, I don't think I can keep doing this. I don't think I can be here every night. By that point, I had weekends off, but I was still there every weeknight. And I knew it, I knew it. Always before I felt like, no, I'm not done yet. I need to stay with this. But in that moment, I knew that had to change. And I told Eileen and Sinai, and they said, "Okay, we understand." Part of what was always so wonderful about them is that even though I would fall on my face, they liked the fact that I tried.
Right.
And they respected that. Just as I cared for them, they cared for me. And they said, we'll figure it out. So they got other friends who could help. And for a while, I was still there, but I slept out in my dad's old study at the other end of the house. And I can still remember the first night I closed the door and went to bed.
And that was probably liberating, right?
Yeah. And then after that, I wound up changing my schedule so that I was there just 2 nights a week and parts of 4 days. And I wasn't in that same role. And it allowed me in the final 2 years of my mom's life to be less a care provider and more so.
And I think that is so important to know when we have reached our limit, when we are reaching our limit, when we need to transition back into a different role. We don't all have infinite choices. Yeah. You absolutely can do everything at your own expense, but there are also times when you do have options. Yeah.
Right. I mean, one of my beliefs is that almost all caregivers need more help than they think they do. And almost all caregivers realize that later than they should. You know? I was lucky. Maybe I realized it later than I should, but I could.
Right.
Again, because of good fortune, really. Not everyone has that. And that's part of what we need to change to make sure that people have the option for respite, that have the chance to step away, you know, without stepping aside, to just step back a little bit. But I was still there. I still love my mom. It allowed me actually a renewal in some ways of that love and deep affection.
And that's the part that can be really hard to get to cognitively, I think, for caregivers is I can actually be better at this if I do less of it.
Yes.
I think that's extremely challenging, and it takes most of us years.
Yeah.
I think I have one question I want to ask, maybe two, and then we'll go to some questions, and then maybe we'll come back to a final passage. One is you would take your mom to doctor appointments, and you had a really, really great team of doctors. But since we may have some clinicians watching who may be wondering, what would you say to clinicians is important to know about caregivers, elder care, dementia, anything that seems relevant from your experience?
We were so fortunate. The doctors we had initially from Palo Alto Medical Foundation, both my mom's longtime internist, and then a palliative care physician who came and visited my mom for the last few years before she went on hospice. One of the things that I think is really key, and this will sound obvious and yet it isn't in a sense, is that they paid attention to her. You know, they didn't say to me, well, how's she doing? You know, they focused on her. And I really learned over time, not only with physicians, but others who just instinctively knew that my mom still counted.
Right.
You know, they didn't have to ask me how she was doing.
Right.
You know, it could be someone at Pete's Coffee where we would often go. And I remember one time when my mom stopped this guy as we were wheeling out, I was wheeling her out, and she said, I like your glasses. And this young man said, well, thank you very much. I like your coat. And my mom just beamed.
Right.
That's part of it. Just honoring the person that's there. Our hospice, wonderful hospice nurse, Chris Brady, was so great at the way he would always greet Adelaide. And he would say, not Adelaide, he would say, hi, Mrs. Iverson, it's Chris. I want to check a few things. Is that okay? I'm going to take your blood pressure now. I'm going to put this, you know, he would walk through what was going on. Even if my mom wasn't fully present, he always said those things, always. And when he was done and we wanted to talk, he would take us out of the room. We didn't have a conversation at Adelaide's bedside with what was going on. You know, those are basic things. But I think they're so, so important. And I think the other thing we need to think about more is we need to think differently about what care means at a certain point in life. You know, we all think if we fill out an advance directive, then we're all set, or even a physician's order for life-sustaining treatment that, okay, we've checked all the right boxes. It's more than that. You wind up needing to have conversations. Well, at what point do we want to treat a pneumonia? Because antibiotics, which we don't think of as extraordinary care, maybe at a certain point they become that. If your mom has another urinary tract infection, what do we do? We need to have those conversations too. That doesn't mean we necessarily withdraw them, but we need to be able to talk about those things and be sensitive to those things and to think about, because you know, someone turns 65 every 8 seconds in this country. We're going to have more and more old people and older people. My generation, the aging boomers, is, you know, we're your nightmare. I mean, we're going to be around forever.
Gen X here, yes, we know.
So we need to think about these things.
Yeah, no, it's really true. I like a lot of what you're saying touches on Adelaide's dignity, her right to bodily autonomy, and then some of these shades of gray, right? It's not all, do I want to be placed on a ventilator?
Right.
One of the things that occurs to me is, since you and her caregivers, her paid caregivers, took extraordinary care of her, and she did not have bed sores, and her UTIs were noticed, I mean, it's probably not an accident that she lived for 10 years after you moved in.
I think that's true, and I know there have been studies that have shown that hospice actually can often extend life, even though it's palliative care, not curative. The people wind up living longer because of getting that extra assistance. I think that's all true, and that of course raises its own series of questions. Is it possible to live too long? But what are you going to do?
Right.
You know, what are you going to do? I mean, part of what I came to really think about was, well, what does my mom want? And I felt like that she wanted to be warm and dry and cared for with tenderness.
Yeah.
That's all, you know, really. That's probably what we all want.
Right.
We have to figure out how to do that in a
Right.
more consistent way across our society, not just for those whose parents bought a home in Menlo Park in 1950.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. It sounds simple, and yet it was exhausting. And that right there is probably a good summary of caregiving. All right, well, let's go to some questions. Let's see what people have brought. Okay. How did you learn to deal with your anger, resentment, and other negative emotions during this period? Yeah, okay, so let's talk about coping, and then how long did it take?
Yeah. You know, I think the fact that I got angry, not once, not twice, not 5 times, but many more, is indicative of either I'm a slow learner or it just comes with the territory, or both. I think you learn to contend with that in at least maybe 2 ways. One is you try to learn to accept that and to give yourself a little bit of grace with that. You know, I mean, I would think, oh my God, what's wrong with me? But in time, I also allowed myself to think like, well, yeah, this sucks, but it sucks because it's hard.
Yeah.
It's just hard,
Yeah.
you know? And yeah, I probably wouldn't feel so angry and frustrated and exhausted if it wasn't hard, but it is.
Right.
It just is.
Right.
And to accept and acknowledge that. But I also think it's finding ways of getting support and respite. Again, I was lucky I had people there. For me, some of it was exercise. You know, I took up long distance running, which is odd in its own way at age 60 to do. But it provided me with not only time alone, which was immensely valuable, it helped, I think, contend with my own Parkinson's, and it allowed me to feel strong, you know? I took great pride in the fact that I could run a long ways.
Yeah.
And that meant a lot to me as well. But I think we only get there when we're connected to others. If we're steadfast about just keeping to ourselves, I think that's much harder to achieve.
And then when we need a shred of time and permission to use it on ourselves.
Yes.
I noticed the exercise because it spoke to me, but it took me several years.
Yeah.
I don't even think I can count that high to start prioritizing that. And now I know that it is such a mood regulator that there's no other option.
Totally. It's emotional and mental as well as physical. I came to realize it was actually the most important thing I needed to do. You know, even though I had a work life that mattered and lots of people in my life that mattered.
Exactly.
But actually, it was more important that I go for a run than wrestle around with some script, you know, at night.
Right, yeah. No, and I think the older I get, the more that's becoming true for me. My family will attest to this, that I'm exercise the mom.
Yeah. And just wait, Kathy.
Oh, goody.
Just wait another decade or 2 or 3.
Oh, okay, let's see what the next question is. Okay, please let us know how we can find a caregiver we can fully trust with an aging parent in this day and age. It's a good question, and I think I'm going to say there's I think, extra heightened issue with that around the pandemic, given how COVID swept through nursing homes and people's fear and an additional desire to care for their parents at
It's
home.
so true. My caregiving experience was all pre-pandemic, and I realized I was so fortunate. Over 200,000 people died in nursing homes and assisted living facilities. Some of that is because some of those facilities weren't the greatest, but not all of it by any means. There are many fine assisted living and nursing home facilities. It's hard. I think to find a good caregiver, it means bringing that person into your home, talking with them, seeing how that person relates. Is there a connection? Are they asking questions? How does the person who's going to be cared for respond to that person? You can get a sense of that, and you can get a sense of what will he or she bring, what kind of sparkle or personality. One of my first caregivers always was laughing. Well, that's pretty darn good.
Yeah.
If you have someone who is always laughing. Those are things you can find out about and ask for and care for. And then you have to be willing to, if someone isn't quite working out, to acknowledge that too. Just as you might have when your own child was little and you wound up in the wrong daycare. We have to be able to make those choices.
So did you use, on a practical level, did you use agencies? Did you use word of mouth? Did you use both?
All of the above.
Okay.
Agencies, some, and I was very fortunate with some of those individuals. Eileen, or rather my second caregiver, Mele, was the recommendation of a friend who Mele had cared for her parent. And getting a recommendation from a trusted friend is like gold. It's found money. That helped a lot. Some of that was just trusting, like, knowing when I saw Eileen, like, yes, you can tell, you really can tell, and trust that, believe that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let's see what we have next. Can we make that the last question? Did you seek the company of other caregivers or family members to help you through the lonely moments? This is a great question because, of course, there's a lot of value in support and in support groups and in common experiences like that.
It's a wonderful, wonderful question. Two quick stories. I was on the Michael J. Fox Foundation's patient council for many years. And early on, I was talking with my dear friend, Sonia Mather, who was the co-chair of the patient council with me. And I said to her once, Sonia, I'm not much of a support kind of guy. And she looked at me and said, well, what do you think this patient council is, Dave? We all find it in different ways. It isn't necessarily support groups, but absolutely, that group of people was of enormous support. And I had a wonderful friend, a Stanford alum, my class, Margaret Cooper, who was someone who was also going through a different but similar experience, caring for her husband. We would talk and talk about our common bond.
Right.
It's so great if you can talk to someone who gets it, who you can start on page 147. You don't have to start with a table of contents. They know. And I had wonderful friends and sisters-in-law and brothers who understood too, each in their own way. And I would be hugely remiss if I didn't mention the woman who's now my wife, wife Lynn, who put up with me making this choice for many years with great graciousness, and who was there for me in ways beyond how I could ever describe.
Yeah. And of course, Adelaide had put a lot out into the universe that came back to her as well.
Yes, we had these wonderful friends. Your younger friends, which meant people in their late 70s or early 80s sometimes, who came and visited her with great consistency and constancy. I will always remember them. And a great neighborhood, people across the street who became dear friends. So many like that who really made a difference. It's a cliche, but having a community matters.
It does. And so, there are two things that you said that made me think about my own experience a little bit. One is sometimes it's good to have somebody whose experience is adjacent but not exact.
Yes.
So that you don't both go down into the same, morass. Yeah. My closest friend who has a child with a disability, her son has Down syndrome. He was born the same week as my son at the same hospital. But Down syndrome and cerebral palsy are very, very different. And yet we have a lot to talk about.
Exactly.
So yeah, and the other thing that is the patient counsel. I think some of us, we have a bias toward action, and there are all kinds of things that can make you feel agency.
Yes, yes. Yeah, exactly. Because no matter what, you want to still feel like you can make a difference. And that particular association provided exactly that.
Yeah, yeah. I think we might have time for one more question, and then I want to get to the one that I asked to save for last because it's pertinent too. Okay. How did you deal with the enormous role reversal with your mom? And I wonder too, what I suspect some people are curious about is when you are of the opposite gender, as the parent you're caring for, you've got to do some pretty intimate stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, you wind up helping, your mom in the bathroom, something you never quite imagined you would do.
Right.
And that's physical, and it's intimate, and requires intimate contact. And that's what caregiving is. It is a physical act in the end that you have to do and do again and do again. In time, that became completely natural. It's really interesting. I mean, and for my mom too, not just for me.
Yeah.
I can remember when she was having difficulty going to the bathroom, and she would make certain requests of me to help with that process, if you get my drift. And then we kind of laugh about it. I remember collecting urine samples to see if she, when she would sit on the commode, to test for UTIs. And we are both laughing, like, who'd have thought?
Yeah, here we are.
Here we are. But that's okay. There's a certain camaraderie, intimacy from that that's really okay. I don't know. In the end, we went through so many ups and downs and in-betweens. But we made it through.
Right.
We made it through.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. So the last question is, why is the book titled Winter Stars? And you have something that you can read that will explain that.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Kathy. This takes place during the last Christmas that my mom and I shared together. And it begins on one late Christmas time evening. And I should note before I start that my mom was someone who was always restless and always was wanting to move, or would kick against the side of her hospital bed because she wanted to go somewhere. But this night was different. When I walked into my mom's bedroom, I knew right away that on this December night, she was in a different place. There wasn't any restlessness. She just seemed quiet and calm. She looked to be, quite remarkably, at peace. We just sat there for a long time holding hands, and I felt a wave of tenderness come over me. And after a while, my mom looked up at me and said in a voice that was soft and only slightly slurred, "You look wonderful." And I told her that she did too. And I said, "We make a good pair." And she said, "What a pair." We sat for a long while, my hand on top of hers, just sitting there, nothing more. And then she turned her head to me and said, "I feel lucky." And she said it with more clarity than anything I'd heard her say in recent months. And I told her that I felt lucky too, lucky for all that she had added to my life and to the lives of those around her, and that I would always remember what she taught me. And then she said it again. "I feel lucky." And so I asked her if she could tell me why. And there was a long pause. And then she looked at me with eyes as bright as winter stars and said, "Because there's love all around." On that Christmas night, I felt something I hadn't experienced before, that while my time with my mom was still unfinished, our journey was now complete. We had endured our bursts of anger and frustration, but over time, our deep and abiding connection had always held. We'd found a steadying, and while the currents of time and age had taken us into a territory we'd never imagined. We'd kept traveling, and that journey had carried us to our truest destination as mother and son. It had brought me to the bedside of someone I loved so that I could hear the deepest of all truths, that love is all around.
What a pair. Well, Dave, I want to thank you for having this incredibly candid, meaningful, fabulous conversation.
Thank you,
For
Kathy.
sending me the essay in the first place, for writing this book, for sharing your story with everyone.
Thank you for sharing it with me.
Thank you so much. This has been just an absolute delight.
Indeed.
And thank you all for joining us on behalf of the Health Library and the Caregiver Center.
Thank you.
Back at you.